Hello and welcome to the Australia Institute's Policy School. My name's Alice Grundy and I'm a research manager at the Institute. I'm coming to you today from beautiful Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. Sovereignty was never ceded here, and I would like to pay my respects to the custodians of this land. We're up to the fourth class of Policy School, our fortnightly series. In each session, you've been hearing from policy experts at the Australia Institute who take you through the most important policy issues like fair tax, electoral reform, the Australia-US relationship, the housing crisis, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. You've been learning about key issues and the current policy landscape, what the evidence-based research shows, barriers to reforming policy, the most persuasive arguments and key messages, and how to communicate cut-through facts and data to help you change minds. At the end of each episode, you've been growing the skills to confidently advocate for what needs to be done in different areas of policy, explain why it needs to be done, and how we can all work together to achieve a more just, sustainable, and peaceful society. A few reminders: you can type in questions for our panelists using the Q&A box, and you can upvote other people's questions too. You can put your questions in the chat anytime, you don't have to wait to the end. And remember to keep things civil and on topic, otherwise we'll boot you out. Finally, this is a live session and it is being recorded. The video will be available on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. In this episode, we have the Australia Institute's Director of Democracy and Accountability, Bill Browne, and Executive Director Richard Dennis on the shifts in the Australian political ecosystem, so that there is no longer such a thing as a safe seat. Viewers will remember from Bill's previous episode that his areas of interest include truth in political advertising reforms, digital technology, and the role of the states and the Senate in Australian democracy. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
And Richard has spent the last 20 years moving between policy-focused roles in academia, federal politics, and think tanks. He was also a lecturer in economics at the University of Newcastle and former associate professor in the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU. He is the author of several books, including Econobabble, Curing Affluenza, and Dead Right, How Neoliberalism Ate Itself and What Comes Next. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks.
So the structure for today, Richard's going to talk through the 2022 election upset. Bill's going to talk about understanding preferences and swings. Then we'll move to the major parties and elections, the effects of the growing non-major vote, and the implications for no safe seats. Over to you, Richard.
Oh, thanks, Alice, and thanks, Bill, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Let me just start with what I mean by no such thing as a safe seat anymore. What I mean is that in Australia today, there is no seat, there is no politician who can't lose. That doesn't mean everyone will lose, but we've kind of been trained to think that there are marginal seats and safe seats. And safe seats, you don't even have to worry about them. You know, the same party always wins them. And we're going to present a range of evidence today and explain that data, hopefully, in an engaging, easy for people to understand way, because this just isn't true. It has never really been true, but it's really not true now for a number of reasons we're going to talk about. So when I say there's no such thing as a safe seat, what I mean is every seat is now vulnerable to the right candidate running the right campaign. So to give you an example, I'd say there are seats that you can safely say Labor will never win. I don't think Labor was ever going to win the seat of Mackellar up in the Insular Peninsula, and I think you can safely say the Liberals won't ever win the seat of Grayndler or Sydney, Tanya Plibersek or Anthony Albanese's seat. I think you can safely say that the Liberals won't win those seats, but that doesn't mean that seats are safe against anyone. And for a range of reasons that we'll talk about today, it's now obvious that the right candidate, who might be a minor party candidate or it might be an independent candidate, running the right campaign focused on the right issues, can actually win almost any seat. So the example I like to use is the seat of Mackellar at the last election, formerly Bronwyn Bishop's seat, for those old enough to remember Bronwyn, a very safe Liberal seat. And then that safe seat was won by Jason Falinski, the implications of which is, this is a young man that's going somewhere. He will be in that safe seat for decades. And from that safe seat, will likely become, a senior minister or a prime minister one day, because it takes decades in Parliament to kind of get the numbers to get to the top. So you need to be in a safe seat to rise through those ranks. So Jason Falinski holding a safe seat like McKellar was a very significant thing for him and for his party. But at the last election, even though Jason held his safe seat by 13% on a two-candidate preferred basis, and Bill's going to explain this in a minute, that's part of the point, but even though he had one of the safest seats in the country with a 13% margin, he lost. He lost bad. He lost big. He lost to Dr. Sophie Scomps, who was a local GP who'd never run for Parliament before, with a campaign manager who'd never run an election before. And the swing against Falinski, 15%, knocked him out of, it wasn't even close on the night. Everyone knew he was gone. Now, the consequences of this, an up-and-coming future leader, a future minister sitting on a 13% margin, losing their safe seat, if you take that serious, and of course on the night there were lots of safe Liberal seats that left. We're just using the example of McKellar tonight. If Jason Falinski wasn't safe with a 13% margin, who's safe? Almost no one. So if Jason Falinski could lose a seat on a 13% margin, with Sophie Scomps picking up a 15% swing away from the Liberals, then by our count, that means of the 150 seats in Australia, 130 of them, 120 of them, 120 of the 150 are now marginal seats. If Falinski could lose with a swing that big, well, then 120 seats at the next election are marginal, which means marginal and safe don't really mean much anymore.
We've introduced a few terms there, and so we want to kind of take some time to go through how how things work in Australian elections with our preferential voting system. I'm just to give you a sense, or to give you the background of what we're going to be talking about. So in Australia, particularly at federal elections, we have full preferential voting. When you turn up to your voting booth to vote for your local member, you're going to get a ballot that has the name of each candidate running in your election, and then a box beside their name. So we've got fake examples here with, a few fruit-based parties. 4 candidates running an election. You must number every box in order of your preference. So our voter here wants the pear party the most, then the orange party, grape party, and finally the strawberry party. Now, the Electoral Commission will collect all of those votes and arrange them based on the first preference. So your vote for the pear party sits in a pile. 10% of your electorate, probably about 10,000 people, have also chosen the pear party, and so on for the other parties, with the strawberry party getting the most primary votes, the most first preferences. But it's not just about the first preferences. And we need to eliminate the pear party because they received the least votes.
Sorry, Bill, just to be clear, on election night, they literally make these piles. They literally pile them up, and then they say, who came last? Let's pick up all those ballot papers from the people who came last and spread them out, which is what Bill's about to show you.
And indeed, when they go through and look at everyone's second preference in the pear party pile, like a lot of people, you've chosen orange for second, also grape, and then a few people have chosen strawberry. And so they redistribute, including physically redistribute, as Richard says, those pear party votes to the other piles. But it doesn't end there, because we still have 3 people in the race for a seat that only one person can win. Your vote's sitting in the orange pile, but that won't last for long because they have the next fewest votes. They're eliminated. And you can see there that your third preference of grape is something that's shared by most of the people who are currently sitting in the orange pile. So those are redistributed to strawberry and grape. And then an interesting upset has emerged. Although strawberry had the most primary votes, it's grape that has the most votes once all the preferences are allocated.
So there was a strong anyone but strawberry vibe in the electorate.
Exactly. And indeed, we can visually see this. If we go back to the original allocations of votes, but look through them to just which of the 2 parties that ended was preferred, we can see that grape is strong in both of the kind of runner-up parties. And this is our distinction here between the primary or first preference vote, where your vote was sitting with pair, and the two-party preferred vote. We allocate it according to the two biggest parties in the country, Labor and Liberal and National Coalition in Australia's case, and we get a two-party preferred vote. Now, you can go across the entire country, add up all of the two-party preferred votes across each of the electorates, and come to a national two-party preferred vote. So we've got 3 fake electorates there. Add them all together. Strawberry's got 58% of the national two-party preferred vote. And then we can compare from one election to the next. Let's say at the last election, Strawberry got 51%, this time 58%. We call that a 7% swing in two-party preferred terms to Strawberry. Then we can also zoom in on the individual seats. And here we come back to Richard's language of marginal versus safe seats. We've got classifications. Marginal seats, those where the winning party holds it by less than 56% on those two-party preferred terms. We also say that if it's 53%, it's a 3% margin above the 50% that you need to win. Fairly safe, 56 to 60%, and then safe, over 60%. So in our electorate of Metropolis, over 15% of voters need to change their mind between preferencing Strawberry first to preference Grape first in order for Grape to win that seat. And indeed, if we go back to real world examples, we can see that these terms are meaningful. Looking from the 2001 election onwards, the major parties have taken 117 seats, mostly off the other major party. And the overwhelming majority of those, 96%, were marginal seats for one party when the other party took it. Then a declining number, 14, were fairly safe, and just 7 were safe. So if you're a major party candidate eyeing off another major party candidate in a safe electorate, you've got this historical data that makes you feel fairly confident.
Yeah, so an up-and-coming Liberal, up-and-coming young person who's in the Liberal Party that really wants to get into Parliament knows that if they're running against Anthony Albanese or Tanya Plibersek, historically they've got almost no chance of winning. The major parties don't take safe seats off the other major parties.
And that brings us now, Richard, to kind of how have the major parties related to this system and this two-party race?
Yeah, so basically what this has done is create a culture in Australia where because people know certain seats are safe, the only way to be kind of powerful within the party is to get your hands on one of these safe seats. And pre-selection battles for safe seats are things that people will literally spend a decade working on. You know, we have the terminology of branch stacking, which, you know, sometimes is fake members being paid for by a silent donor. That's illegal these days. But the reason that people, or branch stacking might be just working your butt off to get people to join your local branch so they can vote for you in a pre-selection one day. People put enormous effort into these pre-selections because the prize is so good. The prize is a safe seat, which if you can win the pre-selection battle, if you can get yourself as the Labor or Liberal candidate on the ticket, it's a pretty much done deal that on election day you will win. And the same is true every 3 years. And that gives you the time and the headspace to plot to be the treasurer one day or plot to be the prime minister. Whereas a whole bunch of other people are often getting begged to run as candidates in marginal seats. Please, Bill, please, will you run, you know, in this sort of marginal seat or this safe Labor seat? Would you please do that? So there's not a lot of branch stacking going on to get pre-selected into a seat that's safely held by your opponent. So the consequences of that is, you know, to use a military metaphor, it's like back in the 18th century, you know, when people would literally wear blue uniforms and red uniforms and meet at 9 o'clock in the morning on a predefined field, and the soldiers would sort of march towards each other in straight lines in an agreed battle. Well, the generals sat well out of range. literally, with a gentleman's agreement, and they were all blokes. I promise we won't have any snipers. I promise the generals won't get killed. Our troops will do battle, but we sit back here at safe range. If you've ever heard the term rear admiral in the Navy, the rear admiral is the rear admiral is far more senior than just an admiral, because in the olden days when the ships would come in and fire their cannons at each other, it was dirty, dangerous work. The rear admiral, guess where he was? At the back of the line, right? Because the big kids don't put themselves in danger. That's for younger, more naive folk. So in Australia, we've got this political culture where our leaders sit in safe seats. The contest takes place in these marginal seats, and think about what that means. We know that even though there's 150 electorates in Australia, there's 25 million Australians. We all know that come election time, we'll have journalists, political analysts from the press gallery and elsewhere saying, these are the marginal seats that matter. I'm going to do a profile of this outer metropolitan seat, and we're going to talk to some people on the street and ask them what they're thinking, because these are the votes that matter. These are the swinging voters in these handful of marginal seats will decide who the next prime minister is. And the rest of us are just filler. Like, we're just apparently spectators, because Bill lives in a safe seat, so his vote doesn't count. I live in a safe seat, so our votes don't count. So this idea of safe seats and marginal seats is incredibly important for power structures within our political parties. And it's incredibly powerful in the way that our media and voters see, is democracy something I can be a part of? Because 80–90% of voters have been told for decades, oh, your vote doesn't matter. No wonder people are disengaged with politics. They've literally been told, oh, you live in a safe seat, your vote doesn't matter. Well, guess what? There's no such thing as a safe seat anymore. We'll give you more evidence of this soon. But again, if Sophie Scomps can knock off Jason Falinski, then all seats are vulnerable. And when all seats are vulnerable, all votes are valuable. It's a good line. And in turn, we're going to have a more engaged democracy. And we're seeing that. We're seeing Liberals say, well, if we do this crazy skeptic stuff, we're going to lose even more safe Liberal seats. Good. That's democracy working.
And the tool that those commentators and politicians will likely use or misuse to figure out which of those seats to focus on is the electoral pendulum. And I'll kind of start by explaining the electoral pendulum, and then from that to kind of go on to how the changing pattern of votes has served to upset those old certainties. So the electoral pendulum, which has been used in Australia for about 50 years, was introduced to Australia by Malcolm Mackerras, a psephologist, a political analyst, tries to explain the relative vulnerability of political parties when the national sentiment changes. So if we go back to our fake parties, Strawberry and Grape, imagine that they each win 50% of the two-party preferred votes. Australians are exactly balanced between them. And in this 10-seat parliament, they've each won 5 seats. How vulnerable are they to a change in the national sentiment? Well, in fact, the inside of the pendulum is that it matters very much how those seats are won, whether they're safe or marginal. So if we imagine that Strawberry won its 5 seats with 65% of the vote, that's a 15% margin above the 50% point at which they lose the seat. On the other hand, Grape won 3 of its seats with 51% of the vote. It's a 1% margin. And the other 2 seats on 85% of the vote. The pendulum then is that we imagine that the national swing, the national change in sentiment follows across in every electorate. If there's a 2% swing to the Strawberry Party, they gain 2% of the vote, then that happens in every electorate. Or it happens differently across electorates, but it all balances out in the seat numbers. Well, in fact, a small change in national sentiment towards the Strawberry Party could cost Grape 3 of its 5 seats. But even a large change in sentiment away from Strawberry to the benefit of Grape could leave Strawberry still holding on to all of its seats. And when you extrapolate from that fake diagram to the actual pendulum, you can see how it works out.
That's our current parliament we're looking at right now.
That's the one heading into 2022 election.
Okay, yeah. So that's all the actual seat names written out on an actual fake pendulum.
That's right. And based on the kind of real results that they got in 2019. So use the 2019 election to figure out where you're placed for the 2022 election. And Malcolm McCarris has kindly made his pendulums available on his website. And I recommend you check them out if you're interested in this. And they're dense with information, but they're well worth referencing. Obviously, there's too much here for us to take in. But let's zoom in on the marginal seats, which we've been told are the most important seats. Heading into the 2022 election, we see that Bass, for example, had been won by the Liberal Party with 50.5% of the two-party preferred. And we know in 2022, there's a 3.7% swing to the Labor Party across the whole country. Drawing that on the pendulum, you can see, and then drawing which seats actually held and which fell, you can see already an upset for the idea that you can predict individual seat results, because the seat of Bass, held by Bridget Archer, did not fall, even though it was the most marginal in the country. Browne as well didn't get the memo. They had a swing to the Liberal Party that was so large that they went from being a seat that Labor was supposed to win to a fairly safe Liberal seat today. But we don't need to be too critical because of the pendulum's intended purpose of predicting the overall change in seats. It actually did pretty well. It missed a few marginal seats that it thought Labor would pick up, but on the other hand, Labor picked up a bunch of seats that go beyond the national swing. So overall, thinking about sheer numbers in the fight between Labor and the Liberal National Coalition, the pendulum does pretty well, but it doesn't get the individual seats necessarily right. The thing that complicates this, though, is the enormous increase in the independent and minor party vote, from less than 1 in 10 in 1972 to about 1 in 3 in 2022. That gets independent and minor party candidates over a critical threshold where they're able not just to influence seat outcomes as their preferences are distributed to the two major parties, but to actually win seats in their own right. And if we look at the electoral pendulum zoomed all the way out and identify where minor party and independent candidates picked up seats from the major parties, it totally upsets our marginal model.
It sure does, Bill.
What we see is none of the action for crossbenchers takes place within that national swing. Most of it doesn't even take place in marginal seats. And even those fairly safe seats are not the only place where seats are falling. You have to go all the way up the pendulum on both sides, Labor and Liberal, to see seats falling to independents.
Which is why I'm obsessed with McKellar.
Exactly. And the data bears this out. Going from the 2001 election forwards, we see the opposite pattern to what we saw in safe seats. When crossbenchers win seats, they usually win safe or fairly safe seats, whereas the majors usually won minor seats. And for commentators misusing the pendulum to try to call individual seat races, which ones are most in play, you can see they're going to be severely disappointed, with the pendulum going from predicting about half of seat changes in 2007 to less than 1 in 4. One reason for this is because independent minor party candidates...
Sorry, Bill, can you go back to that slide? I just think it's so important. What that says is that the last election, only 22% of the seats that changed hands were the marginal seats predicted by the national swing. Only 22%. 78% of the seats that changed hands at the last election were not the marginal seats we expected to fall. So really what we're saying here is that the way that the commentariat and are using the pendulum is just not helpful, because we're telling everybody, hey, you only have to look at these seats, but actually 78% of the seats that changed hands weren't the ones we were told are important. Sorry.
No, thank you. independents and minor party candidates are often more popular among other voters for other independent candidates and other minor parties, and voters for the other major party in a seat. And we have here the electorate of Groom. This is real data from the last federal election, 2022.
One of my favorite ever election counts ever. Watch what happens, everybody.
And now, at this point, the kind of initial distribution of preferences should be familiar to you. AFP got the least votes.
Who's AFP?
The Federalist Party, small right-wing party. They get distributed. The United Australia Party, Clive Palmer's outfit, is the next lowest, so it gets distributed. Perhaps not surprisingly, a lot of United Australia Party voters preferenced One Nation, but not all of them. Then the Greens are the next. They spread out fairly evenly. Now we're up to the first of two independents running in Groom, Christy Smolensky. She's got the least votes of all those remaining. She gets redistributed. But unsurprisingly, a lot of her voters then preferenced the other independent in the race. Susie Holt was similar enough for her to get the next preference. That lets Susie Holt pull ahead of One Nation, which means Susie Holt is not eliminated, One Nation is. And once again, a crossbench candidate attracts preferences from a lot of voters who'd voted for other crossbench candidates.
And to be clear, a lot of One Nation voters have become One Nation voters because they don't want to vote for Labor or Liberal. So people get a bit surprised with their simple left-right thingamajig going on. But yeah, what we've just seen here is that when One Nation were excluded, when they had the lowest number of votes, most of their voters had a strong preference for some independent than either major party, which is why...
Indeed, why Susie Holt now pulls ahead of Labor. And when Labor is redistributed, again, most Labor voters prefer the independent to the Liberal National candidate. So Susie Holt goes from 8% of the primary vote to 43% of what we call the two-candidate preferred. It's not two-party preferred because Labor isn't in the mix. It's two-candidate preferred. Now, that might seem peculiar, but if we go back to our primary votes but then use a kind of X-ray vision to see where the preferences lie, we can see that it was always true that 43% of the electorate preferred Susie Holt, 57% preferred the Liberal National candidate.
Bill, can I just go off script and encourage people to go today to the ABC's Queensland election results and take a look at what's happening in the South Brisbane seat? Because while all the commentariat have said, oh, the Greens lost South Brisbane, have a close look. What's likely to happen there, or likely, who knows, it's going to be far closer than most people are suggesting, is that, yeah, the Greens may well win that seat because of exactly that kind of preference pile on, but in an even more interesting way. But yeah, go check out the ABC website for South Brisbane.
And then if we show the two Groom results, the two-party preferred between Liberal National and Labor, and the two-candidate preferred, we see again this idea of safe seats breaking down. Groom is safe for the Liberal Nationals against Labor, as it ever was, but it's now only fairly safe against Susie Holt and potentially other candidates like her.
And FYI, Susie Holt's running again, I suspect, at the upcoming 2025 election, and her primary vote might even be a bit better this time around.
So, Richard, that brings us to kind of the implications of no safe seats for the country.
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of things that we need to talk about here. And the first is that when we understand how preferences flow like that, when we can strip away the whole kind of, two-party preferred thing and actually understand what's happening, we can do things as Bill's done, and we've published this research before. We can look at, well, what's the primary vote required to win a seat in Australia? And what we know, I'll just make sure I get the numbers right here, is that on average, for the coalition to win a seat at the last election, on average, across all the seats they won, they needed a primary vote of 44% to win. Labor needed a primary vote of 42% to win, so a bit lower. Why would that be? How come Labor can win on lower primary votes than the Libs? Probably because Green preferences flow so strongly to Labor that, you know, when you're looking at the numbers, you often can kind of add Labor and Green together and think, oh, I think I know how that's going to play out. But to go through the numbers carefully, Coalition at the last election, average primary vote for the seats it won, 44%. Labor, average primary vote for the seats it won, 42%. Crossbenchers, well, crossbenchers won with an average primary vote of 36%. 36% compared to 44% for the Coalition. Why is that? How come the average crossbencher is winning on such a lower primary vote? Well, the answer is because so many Labor voters who have lived in safe Liberal seats thinking, oh, you know, I'm not happy, but my vote doesn't count. Well, they strongly preference independent candidates. So the crossbenchers average to win a seat, 36%. And, you know, if you think about that graph Bill showed with the average primary vote for independents rising and rising, well, that's obviously good news for independents. But the better news for independents is as it's rising and rising, they don't have to get to the same dizzy heights the major parties need. Independents get better preference flows from other minor parties and they can win on lower primary votes. So while the primary vote's going up, that's obvious, people have noticed that. People haven't noticed that the threshold for an independent to win is often significantly lower. And the best example of that was Kylie Tink winning in North Sydney, who got a much higher primary vote than Susie Holt in Groom. But Kylie Tink won her seat off a primary vote of 25%. So 25% of people wrote 1 next to her name. That's no mean feat. But the parties the parties and other independents that she beat strongly preferenced her ahead of Labor or Liberal, and she went from a 25% primary vote to winning the seat. So there's really important implications of understanding how preferential voting works, because not only are there a lot more first preferences being cast for independents and minor parties, but when you understand the fact that there's a lot of Labor voters that really don't want to preference the Liberals, and a lot of Liberal voters that really don't want to preference Labor, that actually gives an advantage, in inverted commas, to candidates that aren't perceived as either of them. So very significant implication there that because crossbenchers win off lower primaries, and because the vote for crossbenchers is rising, kind of things are breaking faster, certainly a lot faster than the Liberal Party expected, than the simple trend might explain. The other important implication is this whole idea, again, that's just frankly lazy commentary, the national mood. You know, the national mood says there'll be a swing away from the government because the nation feels a particular way. The pendulum will show us how the nation feels, and then we can predict the seats that are lost because of this national pendulum sweeping across you know, these marginal seats, knocking them over, you know, politely one at a time. It's not true. Like, it's never been true. But when there was only 2 parties effectively in the race, that idea of left, right, and a pendulum swinging, it's also wonderfully two-dimensional. That used to have some traction. It just in 3- and 4-cornered contests with independents and Greens and One Nation or Katter Australia Party in Queensland. Like, now it's just so much messier than that. I mean, it's a wrecking ball, right? It's not a pendulum. It's just this thing moving around. And to give you some examples of this, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'll get them about right. So at the last federal election, there was a swing to Labor in Western Australia of 8%.
Yeah, 8 or 9.
8 or 9%. So swing to Labor of 8 or 9%. But there was a swing against Labor in Tasmania of 2 or 3%. So what was the national mood? Like, it doesn't mean anything. You can't have the average of the national mood. So one thing to keep in mind is that the idea that there's only marginal seats that matter, well, that's obviously silly, but it's silly to also think there's this national mood that will have the same impact on parties in one state or in one part of the country as another. Guess what? Different people in different parts of the country feel different. That's why we have the House of Representatives. Like, we're not just electing a president with no parliament, we're electing 150 members of parliament because we think people are different. So the idea of the national mood doesn't help us. The idea that it only marginal seats that matter doesn't help us. The other reason that we need to kind of reconceptualize our language and our way of thinking about this stuff here just quickly is that, you know, when we talk about the national mood, it's as if the national mood falls like rain upon us and then distributes itself across the electorates, forming deeper and shallower puddles in different places. So we start with the national mood and then we see where the national mood landed. But of course, the opposite's true. The national swing isn't some national thing. It's literally the sum of all of the feelings of all of the voters in all of the seats. Right? We don't start with a national mood and see how it went in the electorates. We literally count the votes in all of the electorates and turn it into the national mood. So, you know, to wrap this bit up, it's just not helpful, let alone true, to say, don't worry about where you live and who you're voting for and your candidate. It's all much bigger and above your pay grade than that. You know, greater minds than yours have puzzled over this. You can't change the national mood. Therefore, who cares? Well, you don't have to change the national mood. Changing the local mood is how you change your local member of parliament. And that's what's happening in increasing numbers.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Bill. We've had a very animated chat and lots of questions for you. The first one is from Paula Gleason, who says, having lived through the McKellar election, two of the strategies that I sense were compelling for Scoms was the success of Zali Steggall in Warringah in the prior election, but even more banal, the strategy of having people with posters along Pittwater Road smiling, dancing and waving. Is this the type of on-the-ground campaigning that works?
Oh, absolutely. And it's always worked. The question is if both major parties agreed not to do much of that, then neither major party had to do any of that. Or similarly, if people knew that McKellar was a safe seat, why would the local Liberal Party put a lot of time into being out there talking to people and showing people, hey, we're here, we care, we're listening? Historically, what's happened in Australia is that someone like Tony Abbott, who held the once safe seat of Warringah, wasn't safe, he lost it. What Tony Abbott's job was to motivate donors, to motivate volunteers, to get all these people and then bus them out to Western Sydney and campaign for a candidate out there. But again, to understand the power structures that sit in this stuff, Tony Abbott just didn't randomly take literal donors and volunteers to a random Liberal seat. He went to help a Liberal candidate who was effectively promising to vote for Tony Abbott in future leadership ballots. That is, power was built and accumulated in these safe seats and then spent elsewhere. Similarly, Josh Frydenberg at the last election, his job was supposed to be as treasurer in a safe seat to help raise millions of dollars and then go and spend that on other people, getting other people elected, who in turn would demonstrate fealty to him. But of course, at the last election, he had to spend millions of dollars trying to hang on to his own seat, which he lost, which a whole bunch of other people in the Liberal Party are like, well, you were never going to win, mate. But if you had given me that money for my seat, maybe I could have won. So yes, absolutely. Door knocking, people standing on the side of the road. What they're actually doing is showing to their fellow voters in a community, hey, you know, if you're feeling like voting for this candidate, you're not alone, you're not crazy, you're part of something else that other people think. But in safe seats like McKellar in the past, what we called safe seats, they probably just didn't put the effort in.
I'd just pick up kind of also on the point that the campaign drew kind of inspiration from Zali Steggall's success. And I think that's been a striking feature of the independent campaigns, that Cathy McGowan back in 2013 breaking through, and Zali Steggall as well, that's kind of provided a model that people can draw on and firmed up people's belief that it's worth the effort. Ireland is the other Western democracy alongside Australia that has so many independents. And what they found is that after the election in which the independents had their breakthrough success, there was another wave of success at the next election because the early adopters had proven that it could work and more people got involved.
And to be clear, you know, I've been looking at polling on this for decades. One of the main reasons people don't vote for minor parties or independents is they haven't heard of the candidate. because the media typically doesn't cover them because they're not going to win. So there's a sort of cycle that works against new entrants there. So haven't heard of them is the main reason people don't vote for them. Didn't know what they stood for. Same thing. Didn't get any media coverage. But another one was I don't want to waste my vote because they're not going to win. And that's because people don't understand preferential voting, where you can't waste your vote. You might miss out on your first preference, but if your first preference isn't elected, your vote transfers at full value to your second or third. So I think more and more people, when more and more people win these races, it's harder for people to think it's a wasted vote to vote for these independent. Even if they don't understand preferential voting, at least they know independents can win because they're now so visible.
Mm. We have a couple of questions on how to vote cards, one from Kate Cooper asking about their impact, or one from Chris Chaplin saying if voters are increasingly more likely to make up their own minds rather than following a how to vote card, what kind of impact is that going to have?
How to vote cards have historically been quite important in Australia, but mainly because minor parties were seen as preference funnels towards major parties, and preference deals that people don't like the sound of. I've actually done a few. They kind of got a very bad name. But a preference deal might be, well, I'll hand out a how to vote card saying I'll put Bill ahead of someone else if Bill will put out a how to vote card saying he'll put me ahead of someone else. Right? You're saying to voters who trust you enough with their first preference, well, if you trust me with your first preference, here's my advice on what to do with your second preference, third. So, I actually think that how to vote cards are helpful and have a role. But that's a controversial opinion. But not everyone follows them. There's no obligation to follow them. And for example, but they still matter. So again, in the Queensland election, the Liberal Party have this time handed out how to vote cards saying vote one Liberal and put the Greens last. So the Liberals have basically said, if you can't get a Liberal elected, we think you're better off getting a Labor person elected than a Green elected. Now that's fine. That's up to them. But a lot of their voters don't follow that ticket. But it looks like in Queensland, because we've got an experiment, not this election, the previous election, the Liberals said, if you can't get a Liberal, it's better to have a Green than a Labor. This time they've said the opposite. And it looks like preferences flowing to Labor from people who voted Liberal have gone up from about 40% to about 65%. So how to vote cards matter, but they kind of matter in the sense that if you trust the Liberal Party, if you're saying, here, I'll put you in Parliament to make tax laws and spending laws for the next 4 years, it kind of makes sense that you would trust their judgment on other candidates as well.
There's some interest in what might happen with an increasingly large proportion of the parliament made up of independents, and whether Paul King's imagining a future maybe where the Coalition and Labor band together and direct preferences to each other over the independents. What kind of effect do you think that would have?
I just said that's happening. Bill, what do you reckon?
I think, so firstly, we can look at parliaments around Australia to get a sense of how a larger crossbench might work. Tasmania, for example, the crossbench, so that's Greens, Independents, Jackie Lambie network, is larger than the Labor Party. They've got more seats. But the coalition in government only needs to work with a few of those in order to stay in power and to get legislation passed. And I think that's one thing that's missed sometimes when people talk about a large crossbench, as if that necessarily means the government's job is harder. A large and diverse crossbench can be quite the opposite, giving the government multiple paths that it can work with. We almost saw that in the ACT, for example, where Labor plus the Greens is enough to get majority, but it was close to Labor plus either the Greens or the Independents being enough to get majority. Well, that actually multiplies the options that the government has.
And of course, in the Gillard era, from a legislative point of view, in terms of the amount of legislation, so Julia Gillard was Prime Minister in a government where she didn't have a majority in either the lower house or the upper house. She had to negotiate with the crossbench in both. in objective terms, passed more legislation than nearly every other government in modern history, but also passed big legislation. It wasn't just lots. It was a carbon price. It was an NDIS, had a royal commission into sexual abuse within the Catholic Church, which didn't need ledge for. But my point is, it was a government that was getting big stuff done that others hadn't done. It wasn't a perfect government. She reneged on a promise about gambling reform, if I remember, to Andrew Wilkie, but there was no one at the time saying, oh, this chaos in the crossbench is impeding the passage of legislation. I'd go one step further. I'd say that the chaos actually enhanced the passage of legislation. Governments almost never have a majority in the upper house. Julia Gillard had to negotiate with the crossbench to pass a bill through the lower house. She didn't want to introduce legislation in the lower house, have it voted down. That would look a bit embarrassing. So she was talking to the Greens and the crossbenchers before she was introducing legislation at the lower house, doing the compromises before she passed the bill. And the Greens, having voted for a bill in the lower house, surprisingly never once voted against it in the upper house. So I would argue one of the reasons that she got so much ledge through was that she wasn't doing the standard, I'm the Prime Minister, I've got a mandate, I've got my bill through the lower house, now the Senate, thou shalt respect my mandate, bow before me. And the Senate never does. They've all read the Constitution. So, yeah, the chaos bit, it's massively overblown. And as Bill said, if you've got a government that's 5 votes short of a majority with 5 independents, that's going to be hard. You know, making sure every independent will vote for you on every bill, that's hard. But if you're a government that's 5 votes short of a majority with 15 independents, well, you've only got to find a third of them on any particular bill. And you know what? That kind of feels like democracy to me.
And this has answered Tim Diamond's question, but I can also recommend Bill's earlier policy school episode on minority governments, which goes into this in a bit more detail. There's a question from Hao Yi Zhang asking, how do we most effectively get new people into seats to bump out career pollies? I see new faces run for local councils, but that seems less impactful.
Bill, what's the best way to get elected?
I mean, I guess the advantage of being in this moment is that we have seen successful models operate. The community independence, most notably, but Di Lee, for example, who ran in a otherwise safe Labor seat in Fowler, she wasn't kind of under the community independent mantle, and she had been involved in politics before, but showed an ability to kind of work with the community, turn out volunteers and supporters, and won the seat. So I think it really has to come back to the community.
Yeah, and look, so it's a good question. There's no simple answer, but one way I'd look at it is that the major political parties formed and were successful for lots of reasons. By the way, we haven't talked about it today, but I think political parties are a good idea. I think they perform an important function. They're kind of offering up a package deal. You know, here's all the things I think of. I'll vote for this for the next 3 years. You know what you're getting. But also, I promise I won't change my mind. I promise I won't agree with Bill or whatever. So voters are increased. So parties have performed an important function in Australia. A lot of voters clearly still like them. More people vote for parties than vote for independents, and more people vote for big parties by definition than vote for the smaller ones. But what's happened, I think an interesting way of looking at this is just like Uber disrupted the monopoly of taxis, just like Netflix disrupted video stores, there's actually a lot of technological change taking place, which is disrupting the market for the business model, sorry to use that phrase, of political parties, which is in the traditional media days, getting on the Channel 9 news at 6 o'clock was essential for any visibility. And if you were a small party or an independent running in one electorate, why would the national news cover you? So when everyone got their news from the same national sources, it was very hard for independents and minor parties to get on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald or get on the Channel 9 news at night. Well, I don't know about you, but basically no one else watching this is consuming that media anymore. So that advantage of the major parties is now to some extent a disadvantage. And similarly, they had a big sort of fundraising advantage. It was easier to raise money across the nation and then spend it in these marginal seats. But with online fundraising and online visibility, it's now a lot easier for an independent to raise money. So some of the big barriers have been removed or diminished technological change. And that's why I think people have to be too careful in sort of thinking, well, should this happen or what can be done about it? It's like, well, technology's disrupted lots of things. Why wouldn't technology disrupt the way, the optimal way for people to sort of organise a political campaign?
Mm. Speaking of organising, Alistair McCulloch says organising Parliament is quite a complex activity, which is simplified by having governing parties, which then get on with organising Parliament. What number of independents do you think might be needed for them to develop what he would call parties of independence?
Or can I tell my joke, Bill?
Yeah.
Hey, Bill, what do they call crossing the floor? So in Australia, we have binding party discipline. Okay, so you're elected to the by the Labor Party brand. You get kicked out, as we recently saw, for voting against it. The Liberals don't have rules as strict as that, but they have a culture as strict as that. So in Australia, when the Prime Minister or opposition leader says we're voting yes or we're voting no, the whole party votes yes or no. Every now and then someone goes, oh, actually, I disagree with my party, and crosses the floor. There's a long setup. Bill, what do they call crossing the floor in America?
I don't know, Richard.
They call it voting. Bill's heard this joke before. Australia has a uniquely, our electoral system's unique in a number of ways. The sort of the dominance of our two parties is quite uncommon because we compare ourselves to the UK and US. Two-party systems are common there, but most European countries are far more comfortable with moving coalitions. So we've kind of got that Anglosphere idea of two-party system, but in the UK, in the US, people cross the floor all the time. No one gets kicked out of the party for crossing the floor. So to reject the premise of the question, there's two ways that that parliaments can change. One is the culture of parliamentarians themselves, thinking, you know what, I oppose this bill. I don't hate my leader. You know, the Prime Minister's a great bloke and I agree with him on 80% of things, but, you know, on this bill, I think my electorate would much prefer me to amend it or oppose it. So there's nothing in the Constitution stopping that from happening. This is just our uniquely rigid Australian hierarchical sort of way of organising Parliament. So we could change the culture of the parliamentarians or put enough independence in there that mean that anyone who's Prime Minister is going to need to go and have those conversations. There's no right number for that. I think the more there is, the more cultural change there is. But again, if you're 5 votes short of a majority, then I think probably you want at least 6 independents. I think, you know, having, and 10 would be better than 5. I think if you're 5 votes short of a majority, requiring 5 independents on every vote, oh, that sounds like a tough term. But I don't know, maybe that'd be good. What do you reckon, Bill?
Yeah, I think that's right. And of course, different countries have had different solutions to the kind of question of party discipline. So the United Kingdom, for example, looser than Australia, but stricter than the United States. And they've got kind of different rules for the government or the party to prioritize certain legislation that it really wants your vote on. And I was reading a book by a party whip from the UK Labour Party. So this is someone whose job is to get people in line behind the vote. And she'd been a previous party defector, and yet she was still allowed to hold this position, getting other people in line because they found a way to incorporate dissent. And similarly, there's even been arguments that, yes, Australia's always had a relatively strict system of party discipline, but there were release valves in the past that are no longer exercised or not exercised as often. We have stats, I can't remember them now, but a couple of rebel Liberal senators in the 50s, 60s and 70s crossing the floor well over 100 times each. You see a bit of that today with Bridget Archer, for example, or even Barnaby Joyce, but in a much more limited sense. And we've also heard from the academic Chris Wallace the argument that Labor used to have a more dissenting caucus and more rigorous debate there. So the party still came together behind the decision, but there was a release valve that could see negotiation happen. And we see less of that today.
And also, that's just reminded me, but one of the earlier questions about sort of, you know, the major parties ganging up. a little bit of history, Bill will be better on this than me, but when what we think of as the Liberal Party was formed, well, before there was the Liberal Party, there was just all these sort of minor parties and independents who united around the idea that they weren't Labor. Like that was the organizational principle of Menzies' Liberal Party, was a bunch of people who weren't Labor. So yeah, it's absolutely possible for new formulations to create purely in opposition to the success of some other formulation.
There's been a few iterations, but the original one was the protectionists joining with the free traders because Labor was so powerful. I mean, you cannot imagine two more ideologically distinct positions.
I forgot that.
Well, we're getting a bit short on time, but one last question for you, which has had a lot of upvotes from Anne Newbren, who asks, can an independent become a minister?
Yes, there's a couple of examples of that. Indeed, even in South Australia at the moment, Minister Dan Cregan is Special Minister of State. He's an independent. He defected from the Liberal Party before the last election. And he is a minister even though the South Australian Labor Party has a majority. So they don't even need the votes of crossbenchers or independents, and yet they've still chosen a minister. South Australia's recently got a bit of a culture of this. Their speaker also has to be independent, although that can be, as is the case now, someone who quits the party in order to be an independent speaker. The ACT furnishes another example. A health minister back during the last Liberal government in the ACT, they did need the crossbench in that case. And indeed, if you go right back, there's been one independent minister under a federal Labor government. That was the government of Chris Watson way back in 1903. First Labor head of government anywhere in the world. And they needed a lawyer for Attorney General. So they actually invited someone from the opposition to become Attorney General. And when his own party worked to bring down that Labor government, that protectionist minister spoke very powerfully about the value of the Labor government then.
And just quickly, shut me up if you need, Alice, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, but in one of the first terms of the Labor Green coalition government here, Shane Rattenbury was, who was the Green, or one of four Greens, was a minister in effectively a Labor Green coalition government, but the other Greens who weren't in cabinet weren't bound to vote, you know, with the government. So Shane, as a Green MP, was a minister in a government bound by cabinet confidentiality and cabinet solidarity, but the rest of his party wasn't. Is that?
That's right. That was Caroline Lakuta and Shane Rattenbury.
When there was two of them, that's right. Yeah. So again, as a party, they were like, well, you can be in the cabinet, you know, and you'd then be kind of stuck with all that cabinet stuff. And I can still be in your party, but I'll be out here chucking rocks every now and then, and that's okay. So, hey, guess what? A bunch of grown-ups can organise things in more complicated and perhaps more interesting ways than some think.
Excellent. Thank you both. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Bill. There was a question in the chat about where listeners can find the notes for the sessions. We have fact sheets for each of the episodes of Policy School on our website. But if you have any further questions, you can email us mail@australiainstitute.org.au. And if you could put Policy School in the subject line. We look forward to seeing you next time. We have a webinar on 14 November when we'll be discussing how governments can help with the high cost of living. That will be with Greg Jericho. And don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube to catch all of our webinars. You can also subscribe to our podcast, Follow the Money, Dollars and Cents, and After America. Thanks so much for coming along today.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.